Hey folks, it's Charlie in Westeros here with a bit of a unique video today. Like so many of you, I grew up in an era where some truly epic fantasy games, films, and TV series were made, and which introduced me to a wide range of mysterious and captivating fantastical beings such as elves, trolls, wizards, dwarves, and of course, man-bear pigs. For a long time, I never really gave much thought to the creative origins of these beings and just sort of saw them as cool or unique creatures. More recently, however, and with a pandemic that has severely limited one's ability to do anything but ponder important questions at night before bed, I began to wonder just why those hot-tempered and fierce dwarves that I marveled at in Lord of the Rings, or would play in the Warcraft series, always sounded so distinctively Scottish. And so, after doing a bit of research, I will attempt to answer that very question in this video. But before I get into the swing of things, I encourage you all to subscribe to my channel for more fantasy, Game of Thrones, and real-world mythology type content, if that is something you just might enjoy. Now, to begin answering the question, I think it's important to understand the origin of dwarves in fantasy series and games. Without creating an entire video about the tales of dwarves, it appears that these beings find their origin in Germanic folklore. Norse lore, which is a branch of Germanic mythology specific to the Nordic or Scandinavian countries, goes into greater depth behind their creation. In the Icelandic Ynglinga saga from the early 1200s, dwarves are primarily associated with metalsmithing as well as death, where they guard doorways in the mountains which are said to be paths between different realms. Though dwarves aren't mentioned as being short in the early Norse tales, later sagas do describe them as small and ugly. After the Christianization of Northern Europe, stories of dwarves endured in the folklore of Germanic Europe. It appears that, during this time, especially in Middle High German heroic poetry, dwarves are described as short men of superhuman strength with long beards, usually living in hollow mountains. They are also described as great smiths, who possess magic abilities. More specific to the question of this video, however, is that the dwarves of Norse folklore do not appear to have a distinct accent nor speak a language separate or distinct from humans. The dwarves of most German stories, however, do not appear to speak any human language. Fast forward a few centuries, and the dwarves make some notable appearances in popular works of fiction, such as the 19th century Brothers Grimm's fairy tale of Snow White, and, later, in the first half of the 20th century, in the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, such as The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien is especially important in this case because he is the one responsible for setting up some of the main tropes surrounding dwarves that we are so familiar with today. That said, and while it is impossible to read the specific accent Tolkien intended for the mythical creatures in his works of literature, it is important to mention that he was, however, a philologist, that is, someone who studies the history of languages, particularly in literature. As a result, Tolkien utilized real-world languages to partially inspire the fictitious languages one can read in his books. Perhaps you might be thinking, aha, so that's where the Scottish dwarves came from. But no, not quite. Tolkien was in fact inspired by a very different language than Scottish Gaelic. In fact, to differentiate the dwarves of his book series from the likes of the elves, Tolkien created the dwarven language of Huzdul through inspiration from Semitic languages like Hebrew and Arabic in providing a voice to this people. As such, Tolkien's dwarven language would have a truly unique sound to it if it were spoken. Take, for example, this dwarvish battle cry, which reads as Baruch Chazad, Chazad I Menu. It certainly sounds somewhat Semitic to me. In short, and to give another example, Tolkien's dwarves speaking their native tongue probably sounded something more like this. You are likely all wondering how the heck the dwarves went from sounding like that to this.
I have the eyes of a hawk and the ears of a fox.
And yes, I am finally getting to that point. In actuality, it all boils down to the differences in the way Tolkien portrayed his dwarves vis-a-vis the reader's interpretation. the Dwarven accent of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings was actually never portrayed with a Levantine Arabic or typical Israeli accent even prior to the Peter Jackson film series of the early 2000s. In fact, it seems like the accent of dwarves in general varied during the second half of the 20th century, regardless as to whether or not they were interpretations of Tolkien's work. It appears as though the first piece which presents dwarves with a Scottish accent was not in fact an interpretation of Tolkien's stories, but the original work of an author, Poul Anderson, who in 1953 wrote a story entitled 3 Hearts and 3 Lions, which was published in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, and which included a dwarf character named Hughie, who had a Scottish accent, the first known Scottish-sounding dwarf, it would seem. The story would be later re-released as a novella in 1961. Some 10 years after that, the Scottish dwarf from Anderson's literary work, mixed with the typical portrayal of dwarves in both Germanic mythologies as well as Tolkien's books, would go on to influence the portrayal of dwarves by Gary Gygax in undoubtedly the best-known fantasy role-playing game ever created, Dungeons & Dragons. As a fan of Poul Anderson's books, Gary Gygax can be credited with first popularizing the trope of the Scottish dwarves to a larger audience. The significance of the Dungeons & Dragons 1970s tabletop game would itself go on to export the rendition of the Scottish dwarf to other popular fantasy series, such as the 1980s Dragonlance books, which were themselves originally created as a setting for the Dungeons & Dragons games, as well as the hugely successful PC game of Warcraft 2, which came out in the 1990s. This, my friends, is where the story comes full circle, when the first of Peter Jackson's film adaptation for The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, was released in 2001 and featured the dwarf Gimli. As you all know, Gimli certainly sounds nothing like a Semitic-sounding dwarf that Tolkien seems to have originally intended for this race, but sounded more like some kind of Scottish brogue, in a similar vein to the dwarves of D&D and the Warcraft series. Thus, from Norse Germanic to Semitic to Scottish, the dwarves of European folklore as well as popular culture have evidently undergone quite an evolution, especially when it comes to their mother tongue. Regardless of their accents, they remain no less a fascinating group of people to fantasy and or mythology lovers. Anyway, folks, this is where the video comes to a close. Please don't hesitate to leave your thoughts in the comment section below if this is the type of content you'd like to see more of in the future. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and of course I will see you all next time.